Alright, we should be streaming now, and YouTube is telling me we are. Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Read Aloud with me, Shelby Music Time, which has become far less music than when I attended when I was in high school, but whatever. Welcome back. We're starting with chapter 16 today in Wicked Lovely. But real quick before we get started reading, I just wanted to let you know, and by you I mean the only person who watches this, which is my mom, that after this I'm planning on reading A Christmas Carol on live, and hopefully getting my whole family involved, my mom and my brothers and everybody, to read some of the fun character voices, because my whole family likes to do fun voices, so we'll have a good time. I hope you join us. Anyway, we're on to reading Wicked Lovely, starting with chapter 16 today. I read for like 2 hours and 9 chapters last go round, and I'm gonna warn you right now, I'm not reading that much today. I have work tomorrow morning, so I'm probably just gonna read for about an hour, if that. So, where did we leave off? Alright, so when we left off, Aslan has just agreed to go on a non-date date with Keenan, because he's been trying to get after her and she couldn't stand it anymore, and finally she just, to get him out of her face, she was like, I will go to this thing with you as a friend. And the dude's thousands of years old. He doesn't understand how to just be a friend with a woman. So, anyway, starting out in chapter 16, I think Aslan is getting ready for her date with, or not date, non-date thing with Keenan in this one. Alright. Chapter 16, let's go. Alright. Seth stirred the pasta absently. He glanced at her. You want to tell me what you're thinking? He didn't say anything else, just waited, quietly and patiently, sensed their kiss and the conversation afterward. He'd been good at his word, waiting for her to make the next move. She went over and watched him, trying to figure out how to tell him about the carnival. She tried to start that sentence several times since she'd arrived. It hadn't worked. This time she just blurted it out. I'm meeting Keenan tonight. Seth didn't look away from the boiling water as he asked, You're going out with the Fairy King? The guy who's stalking you? It's not a date. She was close enough to touch him, but she didn't. He asked me to go to a carnival. He did look at her then. It's dangerous. She took the spoon out of his hand and pulled his arm gently so that he turned toward her. If I don't figure out what he wants, Grams is going to take away the little bit of freedom I still have. I need to figure out a way to make him leave me alone. Seth had that same strange panicked look he had after he heard about the human guys outside the library. He nodded, slowly, like he was thinking, processing what she was saying. She kept talking. Maybe there's something I can do, or say, or over here. She leaned against him, needing his comfort, his support. She was afraid, but she couldn't just sit around waiting for someone to save her. She had to try to save herself, try to figure it out. He didn't say anything, so she said softly, Do you have a better idea? No. He sighed and pulled her close, holding her tightly. This timing sucks. She laughed, because it was either that or weep. You think? The pasta started boiling over behind them, hissing and spattering. She picked up the wooden spoon and stirred. He stood behind her, his hands resting on her hips. After dinner, I wanted to check out some of the ointments in those recipes, so I can see them too. Okay. She looked over her shoulder at him. He dropped a quick kiss on her cheek. It was sweet, tender. His next remark, however, was anything but sweet. You need to move out of the way. What? He nudged her to the side. No wonder you eat all that yogurt. Your cooking skills, he sighed, pitiful. She laughed for real then, grateful that he was teasing, grateful that he wasn't letting her admission spoil what was left of their evening. She smacked his arm lightly. I can stir pasta. It's not a special skill. Half of it will be stuck to the pan if you keep trying to do it. Come on, out of the way. Still smiling, she moved to the side and opened the mini-fridge. A 6-pack of some microbrew sat there. No cheap drinks for him. Only Seth. He didn't share his beer, though. Any drinking done at his place was strictly BYOB. Doesn't hurt to ask. She pulled one out. Can I? You don't drink well, Ash, he frowned. Thought you'd want a clear head. She stopped herself before she told him how afraid she was. Instead, she closed the fridge, holding the bottle. Split it with me? With another disapproving look, he handed her a plate of already sliced bread. So where is this carnival? Down at the river. She set the plate on the table and held out the bottle to him. You could cancel, postpone even, at least until we know more. He twisted the cap off, took a drink, and handed it back. Do you know how many stories there are of people of them stealing people? Hundreds of years, Ash. People being gone hundreds of years. I know. She took a drink, looked at him, and took another. Seth took the bottle out of her hand and pointed at the bread. Eat something. Then we'll try some of those recipes. He glanced at the clock as he started rinsing the pasta. I need to be able to see them so I can find you if something goes wrong. After dinner, Aslan called to check in with Grams. She assured Grams she was in a safe place. I'm with Seth. I'll be here for a while. She didn't tell Grams that she was staying at Seth's. She felt guilty for it, but Grams already worried too much. After murmuring a few more assurances and feeling guiltier, she hung up. I wish I could just stay here. Careful not to bump Boomer, she stretched out on the sofa and closed her eyes for a minute. Seth leaned down and kissed her forehead. He did that a lot lately. Little touches, careful signs of affection, reminding her that he cared. Of course, he still flirted, and the tension was exhilarating. And real, not some fairy trick. Seth is real. She hadn't asked what he wanted, didn't know how, but she was almost positive he wasn't looking for a fling. She opened her eyes. For a moment, it almost looked like her skin was glowing. I'm just tired, she blinked. He sat on the other end of the sofa, putting her feet on his lap. Then he held out a stack of recipes. I've got 3 teas, a couple salves, a few tinctures, and 1 poultice. What do you think? She sat up and scooted closer. A poultice? His hand tangled in her hair, lifting a long strand out and twisting it around his fingers. Something you put on an injury, like putting a stake on a black eye. Yuck. She took the papers and scanned them. Seth's playing with my hair. His fingertips brushed against her collarbone. Then she realized she was holding her breath. Breathe. She let her breath out slowly and tried to focus on the words on the page. Everything felt somehow more important when she thought about where she was going that night and with whom. She held out the paper she'd been trying to read. This one has to sit for 3 days. A few are like that. He took the page with his free hand, the one that wasn't tracing circles on her skin. The tinctures are to steep for 7 to 10 days. I'll start a couple later tonight when you're out. I just wondered if any of them seemed, familiar. She dropped the other pages in the stack on his lap. I was born like this. Grams, my mom, that's just what happens in my family. Something in the genes, like being short or whatever. Right. He wasn't looking at the papers, but at her hand, which was still resting on his leg. Abruptly, he stood up and walked away. Let's try a salve. They seem quicker. She followed him to the counter where he had spread out herbs, some bowls, a knife, and a piece of white pottery with a matching stick. She picked it up. Pestle. She looked at him. What? It's a pestle. Here. He put some of the herbs into the white bowl and held out his hand. She gave him the pestle and noticed how much distance he was suddenly giving her. He used it to grind the herbs, crushing them into tiny pieces. Like this. Then he handed it back. St. John's wort. Pulverize it and dump it in here. He pointed at an empty cereal bowl. Right. She started crushing the strange-smelling plants. Beside her, Seth filled a pan half full of water and set it on a burner. He got out 2 more pans and set them on the counter. So about the other day. About us. She glanced at him, more anxious than she expected. She needed to be sure what it really meant to him, but she was afraid he'd be hurt when she asked. His tone wasn't insulted, though. Instead, he sounded nervous, too. Yeah? Are you... I don't know. Going to ask me out or something? Or is it just casual, wanting to... Just tell me what you want. He took the bowl out of her hand and pulled it up against him, hip to hip. Dinner? A movie? A weekend at the beach? A weekend? Aren't you moving a bit fast? She put her hands on his chest, keeping a little distance between them. Not as fast as I want to. He bent down so his mouth was almost touching hers, but I'm trying to wait. She didn't even think about it. She nipped his bottom lip. They were kissing again, slow and soft and somehow more maddening than the first time. Somewhere between telling him she was meeting Keenan and asking him where they stood, the stakes had shifted. Her hands found the bottom of his shirt, slid under it, over skin and the rings that decorated his chest. Any objections she used to remember had melted. I found the uncrossable line. She almost giggled at the thought. Seth, you in there? The doorknob jiggled. Seth, we know you're in there. Mitchell, one of Leslie's exes, yelled. He knocked again, loudly. Come on, open up. Ignore him, Seth whispered, his lips against her ear. Maybe he'll go away. The doorknob jiggled again. It's probably a good thing, Aslan pulled back further, feeling almost lightheaded. We're not thinking clearly. I've done nothing but think about this for months, Ash. Seth put a hand on either side of her face. But just say the word and we stop. You set the pace. I won't push you, ever. I know that, she blushed. It was a lot easier to give in to the temptation than it was to talk about it. Surprisingly easy. I'm not sure how far that is, though. He hugged her closer and stroked his hand down her hair. So we take it slow, right? Right. She nodded, feeling both relieved and disappointed. There were too many diseases out there to be casual, but just letting go of control, logic, of what she should and shouldn't do. Tempting was an understatement. His voice was low and steady as he said, and yes, dating. There's nothing casual about what I want. She didn't say anything. Couldn't. From outside, Jimmy yelled, Open the damn door, Seth. It's freezing out here. Seth tilted her head up so she was looking at him and said, You're worrying me here. We good? She nodded. You thinking about running again? Her heart thumped too fast. She blushed. No, I'm thinking about the exact opposite. He ran his fingertips over her cheek, pausing at the corner of her mouth, and stared at her. No pressure. Finally, she leaned her face on his chest, hiding her expression. I need to think. If we're going to try this, us, together, I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to mess us up. It wouldn't, but, he swallowed audibly before adding, we don't need to rush. I'm not going anywhere. The knock grew louder again until finally Seth let go of her. He straightened his clothes, turning his back to her to do so. He went to the door and yanked it open. What? Christ, man, it's cold out there. Mitchell pushed past Seth. Jimmy, another one of the guys who had graduated last year, came in behind him. With him were 3 girls Aslan didn't know. Aslan went back to the counter and resumed crushing herbs. Jimmy stopped just inside the door and looked over her with a wide grin. Well, hello, Ash. She lifted the bowl in greeting, but she didn't say anything. Her lips were tender. Her hair felt like it was a mess. It had to be obvious they were interrupting something. Keeping her attention on the salve was easier than dealing with them. She poured the powdered herbs into an empty bowl, adding more, and kept grinding them. Jimmy nudged Seth. What happened to the only friends in this house rule? Ash is a friend. Seth narrowed his eyes at Jimmy and added, the only one who has an open door here. Still grinning, Jimmy came over and looked at the bowl Aslan clutched. Well, this is interesting. What do you got? He picked up the bowl of already pulverized St. John's wort and sniffed. Nothing I've smoked. He was a loudmouth. Mitchell was even worse, especially since Leslie had told everyone who would listen that he was a lousy lay. He set a 6-pack of beer on the counter. The girls were over by Boomer, staring at the boa, but not getting too close. All 3 were dressed in clothes that meant they would be freezing outside. Tight skirts, cleavage-bearing shirts, the sort of thing that'd be uncomfortable even if it weren't human. 3? She looked over at them. Looked at Jimmy, who was making himself at home, picking at the leftover pasta. Thought I asked everyone to let me have a few days to myself. Seth poured the first bowl of crushed herbs into the boiling water and set a timer. Ash, can you grab the olive oil when you finish those? She nodded. Time to yourself, huh? Mitchell grinned. You don't look like you're by yourself. We were. Seth raised an eyebrow and inclined his head toward the door. We still could be. Nope. Mitchell popped the top on a can. Seth took several deep breaths. If you're going to be here for a while, turn on some tunes. Actually, we thought you might want to go out. Actually, we thought you might want to go out, the girl who'd been clinging to Jimmy said. One of the other girls, the one watching Seth, moved to the side, just a little, and Aslan caught a glimpse of tiny horns peeking through her hair, of leathery wings curled behind her. How did she walk in here, looking like that? Only the strongest fae could be surrounded by this much steel and hold on to a glamour. That was one of the rules that had given Aslan the most comfort over the years. The winged girl moved towards Seth slowly, like each step took a lot of concentration. We can't really stay long. Come with us? There's supposed to be a good band down at the Crow's Nest. She offered Aslan a little catty smile. I'd invite you too, but they're strict about the age thing after the raid. 18 only, you know? Slowly, Aslan set the bowl down and went over to stand in front of Seth, between him and the fairy. Seth isn't available. Seth put his hands on her hips, touching her, but not restraining her. Glaring at the fairy, Aslan leaned back against Seth. How dare she come here? Who sent her? The idea of Seth being vulnerable to them made her almost violently angry. Well, this is fun, Mitchell said. Nodding, Jimmy sat down with a pan of half-cold pasta and a fork. My money's on Ash. The fairy kept coming towards the kitchen. Aslan put her arm out in front of the fairy. I think you need to leave. Really? She wrinkled her nose. Yes. She put a hand on the fairy's wrist, not gripping it, but resting her fingers there. Just like at school, contact with the fairy made Aslan's sight clearer. Aslan pushed, gently. The fairy winced and stumbled. Her eyebrows shot up as she gave Aslan a strange look. Recovering quickly, the fairy murmured, Another night, then. No. Seth slid his arm around Aslan's waist. I'm exactly where I want to be. Jimmy and Mitchell exchanged another goofy grin. Man, you need to share your secrets. Mitchell got up and picked up his beer. A quick glance to his date's direction, she came over to stand next to him. Mitchell continued, Not like you ever have trouble getting. He cleared his throat, and his date smacked him on the arm. He grinned. All I'm saying is whatever he's doing, he inclined his head toward the back of the train where Seth's bedroom was, must work. Ash hardly ever even speaks, and he's got her ready to start a fight over him. The fairy hadn't moved. She trailed her fingertips down her cleavage slowly. You'd have fun. More than you'll get here. Aslan slept away from Seth. She wrapped her fingers around the girl's wrist and walked over to the door, tugging the fairy behind her. For such a strong fae, she was unbelievably easy to drag along. Maybe she's weak from all the steel. Go. Aslan opened the door and shoved the fairy forward. Stay out. The fairies outside were all watching. Several giggled gleefully. The vine girl in the suit was there again. She looked up from her newest menagerie of origami animals, which were now walking around as if they were alive. Told you, Carice, she said, and went back to folding more leaves. That sort of approach doesn't work if they're already in love. Aslan let go of the encroaching fairy. Stay away from him. For the night, the fairy looked back inside, her wings opening and closing behind her, slowly, like a butterfly at rest. But really, I think you could do so much better. Freaking fairies. Aslan opened her mouth to say something else. Not interested, Seth called from behind her. Bitch, said one of the girls to Aslan as she left. She stomped out like she had the right to be offended. You didn't need to grab her like that. She was just flirting. The other girl said, Guys don't like pushy girls. They like ladies. At the door, Jimmy paused and deadpanned. Yeah, it's really not a total turn-on. He cracked up. You'd get tired of Seth. Mitchell shoved him. Shut up. Invisible to everyone but her and the fairies, several of the ever-changing group of fae things outside scurried off. Aslan shut the door and leaned against it. Seth was already back at the nasty-smelling concoction, stirring it. Since you don't seem the jealous sort, I'm guessing she was a fairy? Wings and all. She went over, pulled him down to her, and kissed him. But I might be a bit more of the jealous sort than I realized. He grinned. Works for me. He put down the spoon and followed her over to the counter. Thought they didn't like steel. They don't. That's why she was trying to get you out. She was strong enough to come in, but not strong enough to stay long. She couldn't even hold her glamour very well. She picked up another handful of herbs to crush. Do me a favor? Always. Stay home tonight. She picked out a few thicker stems. She glanced back at the door, suddenly a thin barrier against the growing number of fairies outside. I could ask you the same, he murmured. He held her tightly. She closed her eyes and leaned her cheek on his chest. If I don't get answers soon, Grams is going to pull me out of school. I can't stall her much longer, and I don't want to lie to her and say they've gone away. I could come with you. He's not going to talk to me if I bring you along. I need him to think I'm believing him. She stretched up so that she could kiss him, and then added, if this doesn't work, we'll try something else. He looked worried, afraid, things she didn't want to see, didn't want him to feel. But finally he nodded. Be safe, okay? I'll do my best. Because if she didn't, everything would be taken away. School, friends, Seth, everything. Keenan needed to let something slip. The fairies needed to say something that could help her figure out how to get rid of him. They simply had to. A half hour later, Aslan walked down 6th Street, feeling more apprehensive. Oh, sorry. We're in chapter 17 now. Just so you know. Chapter 17. A half hour later, Aslan walked down 6th Street, feeling more apprehensive with each step. Thinking about the fairy coming into Seth's home didn't make matters any better. What if I hadn't been there? Would they hurt him? She hadn't wanted to leave Seth or meet Keenan or deal with the whole debacle, but she needed answers. Keenan had them. She stood outside the entrance to the carnival, looking normal as it was hard to remember that he was one of them. Ugh. Sorry, there was a weird noise. I think it was the cats. Oh, one of the 4 cats. Alright. He stood outside the entrance to the carnival, looking so normal that it was hard to remember that he was one of them. Not just a court fae, but a king. He reached out as he embraced her. Aslan! She stepped backward, easily dodging him. I'm so glad you came. Keenan looked terribly serious. At a loss for what to say, she shrugged. Shall we? He held out his arm, like they were at a formal dance or something. Sure, she ignored his arm and his brief frown as she followed him toward the maze of booths that had sprung up overnight. People milled around in an impossibly large crowd. Families and couples played games on every side. Many of them had sweet-smelling drinks, some sort of golden slushy thing. You're just so... He stared at her, smiling an inhuman smile. I'm just so honored that you joined me. Aslan nodded, like he made sense. He didn't. This is ridiculous. His two eager comments made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. Beside her, a group of girls tried to throw tiny plastic balls onto glass platters. Overhead, the lights of the Ferris wheel sparkled. People laughed and cuddled close to one another as they walked by. Then Keenan took her hand, and suddenly her sight was so clear she gasped. Everywhere she looked, clamors faded. The workers running the booths, the concessions, the rides, they're all fae. All the carnies and quite a few of the guests were fairies. Oh my god. She'd never seen such a large crowd of fairies before. Everywhere she looked, disguised fairies smiled back at her, friendly and happy. Why are there so many fairies wearing human faces? Some real humans milled about, playing rigged games and riding rickety rides, but fairies didn't stare at them. She was the only one they all watched. Keenan waved to a group of fairies who had called out to him. Old friends. Do you want to meet them? No. She bit down on her lip and looked around again, feeling her chest tighten. He frowned. Not right now. She forced a smile, hoping you'd think her nervousness was just shyness. Control. She took a deep breath and tried to sound friendly. I thought we were going to get to know each other. Right. He smiled like she'd given him some rare and precious gift. What can I tell you? What about your family? Aslan stumbled, feet as unsteady as her breathing. I live with my uncles, he said as he led her forward, past a group of fairies that, until a moment ago, looked like they could go to Bishop O.C. Several gestured toward her, but no one approached. In fact, the others moved out of Keenan's path as he led her toward a row of booths where the now revealed fairies ran carnival games. Your uncles? She repeated, feeling increasingly doubtful that coming was a wise idea. She pulled her hand free. Right, the guys who were at school. Fairies, just like almost everyone here. She felt dizzy. She tried again. What about your parents? My father died before I was born. He paused, looking not sad, but angry. I am everything, but everything I am is his gift. Did fairies die? She wasn't at all sure how to respond to his odd comment, so she simply said, my mom is gone too. Childbirth. I'm sorry. He took her hand again, squeezed it affectionately, and intertwined his fingers with hers. I'm sure she was a good woman, and she must have been lovely to your mother. And it must have been lovely to be your mother. I'm not much like her. Aslan swallowed hard. All she had was pictures, In the pictures Grams had around the house, her mother always looked haunted, like she couldn't quite handle the things she could see. Grams never spoke of her mother's last year, as if it hadn't existed. What about your father? Is he a good man? He stopped, holding her hand while they stood there, surrounded by fairies, talking about their families. If she hadn't been able to see the oddly shaped eyes and strange smiles on the fairies who listened, it might seem so very normal. It wasn't. She started to walk away, going towards one of the concession stands where they were selling those sweet-smelling drinks. Aslan? She shrugged, more comfortable talking about a father she knew nothing of than the mother who'd given her the sight. Who knows? Grams doesn't know who he is, and Mom's not here to tell us. Well, at least you have your grandmother. He reached up with his free hand to stroke her cheek. I'm glad you have had that, a loving caretaker. She started to answer, but headed toward them were the pointy face and about 6 of the other fairies who liked to linger at shooters, harassing the regulars, chasing her away from the pool hall with their very presence. She froze, unable to move, years of instinct overriding logic. Aslan, what's wrong? He moved in front of her, blocking her view of everyone and everything but him. Have I offended you? No, I'm just... She offered him what she hoped was a convincing smile and lied. Chilly. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders gently. How's that? Better. And it was. If he were what he pretended to be, kind and considerate, she might have felt bad that she was here on false pretenses. But he wasn't. He wasn't real at all. Come on, let's walk. There's always some interesting games here. She took her hand again, bringing her sight back to full force. Beside them, a woman stood in a child's wading pool, calling, 3 darts for a prize. A thick braid dangled like a rope past her knees. Her face was like one of the angels in old paintings, innocent with a spark of danger in her eyes. Aside from the goat's legs that peeked out under her long skirt, she was gorgeous, but no one approached her. At the next tent, a steady line of fairies and humans waited. Faces Aslan had glimpsed around the city mingled with fairies she could have never imagined. Wings and thorn-crusted skin, and all manners of dress. It was too much to process. Aslan paused, overwhelmed by the sheer number and variety of fairies around her. The fortune-tellers here always put on a good show. Keenan pulled the flap of the tent back farther so she could look inside. There were 3 women with rheumy white eyes. Behind them stood a row of statues, like gargoyles without wings. They were freakishly muscular and alive. Their gazes flitted around the tent, as if they were trying to find someone to answer unspoken questions. The fairies all stepped aside, and Keenan led her to the front of the tent. She stepped closer to one of the statues. It looked wide-eyed, almost afraid as she reached out her hand. One of the women reached out and snatched Aslan's still uplifted hand. No. The woman spoke all at once, not to her or to Keenan, but softly, as if to themselves, in a sibilant whisper. He's ours. Fair exchange, not yours to interfere. The one gripping her hand winked at Aslan. Well then, sisters, what say we? Aslan tugged backward. The woman held tight. So you're the young ones. The fortune-tellers looked at Keenan with her surprisingly blind eye, with her seemingly blind eyes. New lady love. Behind them, fairies pushed closer, scuffing and chattering. The woman gave Keenan a searing look, her white eyes shining, and said, She's different than the others, dear. Special. I already knew that, mothers. Keenan wrapped an arm around Aslan's waist, half hugging her, like he had the right to pull her closer. He doesn't. Aslan stepped away as far as she could with the woman holding her hand. All 3 women sighed simultaneously. Fierce, isn't she? The one still holding Aslan's hand asked Keenan, Shall I tell you just how different she is? How special this one will be? Every fairy there was suddenly stopped talking. They were all watching openly, transfixed and gleeful, as if a horrible accident were happening in front of them. No. Aslan pulled her hand free and grabbed Keenan's arm. He didn't move. As special as I've dreamed? Keenan asked the blind women, his voice carrying clearly to the fairies who pushed forward. There are none who you will meet so rare as she. The three women all nodded, eerily in sync with one another, their three bodies with one mind. Grinning, Keenan tossed a handful of unfamiliar bronze coins to the women, who unerringly snatched them out of the air, their hands moving in precisely the same arcs at exactly the same moment. I need out of here, now. But she couldn't run. If not for the sight, she wouldn't have a reason to react so strongly. The women weren't any stranger than most carnies. Don't expose yourself, remember the rules. She couldn't panic. Her heart still beat madly. Her chest felt tight, like she couldn't breathe. Hold it together. Focus. She needed to get out of there. Get away from them. Back to Seth. She shouldn't have come. It felt like she'd walked into a trap. She stepped away from the women and pulled on Keenan's arm. Let's get a drink. Come on. He pulled her close to him and went with her to the door, past the crowd of murmuring fairies. She is the one. Did you hear? Send the message. Bria will be furious. As the evening wore on, fairies he hadn't seen in years arrived at the carnival. It's a good turnout, even with the hags here to spy for Bria. Emissaries from the other fae courts came, some for the first time in centuries. They know. Keenan, one of the guards from Donya's house, came toward him and bowed. Keenan shook his head, and he spun Aslan to him in a loose embrace, far from graceful, but effective nonetheless. She glimmered faintly in the dark, the sunlight of her changing body already filling her. Sometimes it was like that. The change came on so quickly that the mortal girls grew suspicious. It made sense that his queen, for surely she could be none other, would change even quicker. Behind Aslan's back, a Rowan man in mortal glamour intercepted Donya's guard. What? Aslan stared, looking up at Keenan, eyes wide, lips parted as if she waited for a kiss. Too soon for that. But he did move closer to her, holding her in his arms as if they were at a ball. And we shall have one to show her the splendor of our court, as soon as she ascends to the throne. Glancing past Aslan's shoulder to where the Rowan man had stopped Donya's guard, Keenan said, I don't want anything to spoil tonight. Should the world end tonight, I wouldn't want to know. And it was true. He had his queen in his arms, and after centuries of searching, she was finally in his arms. The Eolas had all but said it. He tilted her head up and whispered, Dance with me. She shook her head, something very close to fear in her eyes. There's no room, no music. He spun her, wishing she had on proper skirts, missing the sway of silk and rustle of petticoats. Of course there is. No one strayed into their path, no one jostled them. Instead, the crowd moved around them, parting to clear a space so that he could have his first dance with her, his queen. At the very edge of the river, he saw his summer fairies, our fairies now, fade from view, shed their glamour, and join the dance. Soon, with Aslan beside him, he'd be able to protect them, take care of them as a true summer king should. Can you truly not hear the music? He led her past a crowd of bog fairies, who hadn't bothered to shed their glamours, but were dancing all the same. Their luminous brown skin sparkled with the light that lay trapped just under the surface, looking like long-lost cousins to the Selchies. Several of the summer girls had begun to swirl in place, waif-thin dervishes of blurring vine and skirt and hair. With one hand on the small of Aslan's back and the other holding her tiny hand, he led her through the swirling crowds of invisible fae, mouth against her ear. He sing-songed laughter, the roll of the water, the soft whir of traffic, the hum of insects. Can you hear it, Aslan? Just listen. I need to leave. Her hair flung across his face and spun as he spun her away and back, closer still this time. She sounded terrified when she said, Let go. He stopped. Dance with me, Aslan. I hear enough of the music for both of us. Why? She was still and stiff in his arms, looking around them, staring into the faces hidden under the mortal masks. Tell me why. What do you want? You. I've spent my entire life waiting for you. He paused, looking at the joy on the faces of the summer creatures, those who'd suffered under Bria's reign for so long. Give me this dance, this night. If it's in my power, I'll give you whatever you ask in return. Whatever I ask? She repeated incredulously. After all the worries, the research, the panic, he offered her an out in exchange for a simple dance. Could it be that easy? One dance and she could leave, get out of here, away from all of them. But if there was truth in any of these stories, fairies only offered exchanges that would benefit them. Give me your vow. She stepped several paces back so she could look him in the eye. An impossible task from up close. He smiled that earth-shaking smile, and her words caught in her throat. She shivered, but she didn't back down. Swear it, in front of all these witnesses, she gestured at the waiting crowd. They were mostly fairies, but a few humans stood by watching, not knowing what the spectacle was about, but watching all the same. The fairies, those invisible and those wearing glamours, gasped and murmured. She's a clever one. Getting a king's vow without knowing what he is, who he is. Will he? She'll make a wonderful queen. Then Keenan raised his voice so that everyone could hear him. In front of all before us, I give you my vow of honor, Aslan. Anything you ask of me that I can offer is yours. He dropped to one knee and said, and from this day forward, your wishes shall be as my own as often as I am able. The fairies' murmurs rose, tumbling together, like discordant songs. What if she's not the one? How could he be so foolish? But the Aeolus said. Still kneeling, Keenan bowed his head to her, hand outstretched. His eyes twinkled dangerously as he looked up and asked, will you dance with me now? Just take my hand, Aslan. All she had to do was dance with him, join the fairy revelry for this one night, and she could ask him to leave her alone. It was a small price for such a reward. He'd never even have to know she knew what he was. Never know about the sight. I will. She slipped her hand into his, almost giddy with relief. Soon it would all be over. The throng cheered and laughed, raising such a din that she laughed too. Maybe they weren't cheering for the same reason, but it didn't matter. They echoed her rejoicing. One of the smiling girls with vines around her arms held out plastic cups filled with sweet golden drink that almost everyone seemed to be drinking. A drink to celebrate. Aslan took one and sipped. It was amazing. A heady mix of things that shouldn't have flavor. Bottled sunlight and spun sugar, lazy afternoons and melting sunsets, hot breezes and dangerous promises. She downed it all. Keenan took the cup from her hand. May I have my dance? She looked the last taste from her lips, like warm candy, and smiled. She was strangely unsteady on her feet, with pleasure. Then he led her through the crowd, spinning her in dances old and new, from stylized waltz to modern moves without any choreography at all. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that something was wrong, but as he twirled her through the dance, she couldn't remember what. They laughed and drank and danced until Aslan no longer cared why she'd been worried. Finally, she put her hand on Keenan's wrist and gasped, Enough, I need to stop. He scooped her in his arms, holding her aloft. He sat back on a tall chair carved with sunbursts and vines. Never stop, only pause. Where did the chair come from? All around them, fairies danced and laughed. I should go. The humans had all gone home. Even the Bone Girls, Scrimshaw sisters, danced. The groups of summer girls spun by, swirling far too fast to be mistaken for humans. I need another drink. Sitting on his lap, Aslan leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing hard. The more she tried to make sense of her flashes of unease, the less clear they were. More summer wine, Keenan called, laughing as several young lion boys tumbled over themselves to bring tall goblets to them as she sat in his lap. My lady wants wine, and she shall have wine. She took hold of one of the etched goblets, spinning it in her hand. Delicate scrollwork traced the surface, surrounding an image of dancing people under a bright sun. The colors in the wine spiraled and shifted like tiny sunrise and burned inside the cup. Where'd the plastic cups go? He kissed her hair and laughed. Beautiful things for a beautiful lady. Whatever. She shrugged and took another long drink. With an arm securely around her waist and hand between her shoulder blades, Keenan dipped her backward. One more around the fair? Her hair fell into the dew-damp grass as she looked up at him, the fairy king, who held her in his arms, and wondered that she was having so much fun. He swung her back up and whispered, Dance with me, Aslan, my love. Her legs ached. Her head spun. She hadn't had so much fun since ever. Definitely. On every side, fairies laughed, dancing in ways that were graceful, wild, and sometimes shocking. Earlier, they'd seemed so sedate, like couples in an old black and white movie. But as far as the night wore on, it had changed, when only the fae remained. Keenan swung her up in his embrace and kissed her neck. I could spend an eternity doing this. No, she pushed him away. No kissing, no. Then they were moving again. The world spun by, a blur of strange faces lost in the cloud of music. The sawdust-covered paths of the carnival were hidden under the shadows. The lights of the rides darkened. But dawn was coming, light spilling out over the sky. How long have we danced? I need to sit down, seriously. Whatever my lady wants. Keenan lifted her into his arms again. His doing so had stopped seeming strange several drinks ago. One of the men with skin-like bark spread out a blanket by the water. Another brought over a picnic basket. Good morrow, Keenan, my lady. He then, with a bow, they left. Keenan opened the basket and pulled out another bottle of wine, as well as cheese and strange little fruit. Our breakfast. Definitely not carnival food. Oops. Fair food. She giggled, then looked up. Behind him, the carnival was gone, as if it'd never been there. All the fairies had left. It was just the two of them. Where did they all go? Keenan held out the goblet again, filled with some liquid sunrise. It's just us here. Later, after you've rested, we'll talk. Then we can dance every night if you will it. Travel. It will all be different now. She didn't even see the invisible fairies that always lingered at the river. They were truly alone. Can I ask you a question? Of course. He held a piece of fruit to her lips. Bite. Aslan leaned in, almost toppling over as she did. But she didn't bite the strange fruit. Instead, she whispered, Why don't all the other fairies glow like you do? Keenan lowered his hand. All the other what? Fairies. She gestured around them, but it was empty of fairies as it was of humans. She closed her eyes to try to stop the world from spinning so madly and whispered, You know, fae things, like the ones dancing with us all night, like you and Donya. Fae things? He murmured. His copper hair glittered in the light that was creeping over the sky. Yeah, she laid down on the ground. Like you. It sounded like he said, and soon like you, but she wasn't sure. Everything was blurry. He bent over her where she lay on the ground. His lips brushed hers, tasting like sunshine and sugar. His hair fell onto her face. It's soft, not like metal at all. She meant to say stop, to tell him she was dizzy, but before she could speak, everything was dark. Chapter 18. Early the next morning, Donya awakened on the floor. Sasha's body between her and the door. No one had brought her a message from Keenan. No guards had knocked on the door. Has he forsaken me? She whispered to Sasha. The wolf laid his ears back and whined. When I actually might welcome his presence, he's not here. She wouldn't weep, though, not for him. She'd done enough of that over the years. She expected him to hear of Agatha's death, to come demanding she accept his help. She couldn't, but it would have been easier, safer, than what she'd have to do now. Come, Sasha. She opened the door and motioned Evan to her. At least he's here waiting. The Rowan man joined her, keeping a respectful distance, standing in the withered grass in front of the porch until Donya said, Come inside. She didn't wait to see if he'd follow. The idea of inviting any one of Keenan's guard into her home, even Evan, whose presence had been as steadfast in the past few decades, unsettled her. Gesturing to the seat furthest from her, she asked, Has Keenan been told about Agatha? He was out when Skelly arrived at the loft. One of the others went to the fair to find him. Evan cleared his throat, but his stare was bold. He was preoccupied with the new queen. She nodded. So it's truly her. Bria would be furious, a force to fear. It'd been so long since Donya had much to truly fear. Between Keenan and Bria, she was cosseted, safer than most any fae or mortal. I'd ask that you allow a few guards closer. Evan dropped to his knees, showing a respect his kind rarely offered any other fae than Keenan. Let me stay here with you. Fine, she murmured, ignoring both his brief look of shock and her irritation at it. I can be reasonable. Then she said the words she'd never said to any of Keenan's guards. Tell Keenan I need him to come. Now. It didn't take long for Skelly to summon Keenan, not long enough for Donya to prepare for the pain of seeing him in her home. When Evan led Keenan in, she stayed in her rocking chair, curled into herself. arms folded tightly over her chest, feet tucked up beneath her. Before Evan had closed the door behind him, returning to the guards outside, Keenan was across the room, standing beside her. Sasha moved closer, pressing his body against her, trying to soothe her. Donya absently patted his head. She glanced at Keenan and said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." In a strange mimicry of Sasha's position, Keenan dropped to the floor. "I've waited decades for you to want me around, Don. Begged to be in your presence. That was before her. She felt foolish for it, but as much as she wanted Aslan to take up the staff, she was jealous. Aslan was the one. She'd spent an eternity with Keenan. Things are different now." Donya tried to keep all of her emotions out of her voice, but she failed. "I'll always come when you want me. How many times have I told you that?" he whispered, his words carrying that warm breath of summer. "That won't change, ever." He reached out, putting her hand over his lips before he could say anything else. A thin layer of frost formed where she touched him, but he didn't complain. He never does. When she didn't pull away, although his breath burned her, "I heard the news from the fair that she's the one." When Evan had told her, she almost wept, imagining an eternity in this pain, alone watching them dance and laugh. "Unless Bria kills me." Don, his lips moved against her fingers, gentle even as they hurt her, just like the words he'd say if she didn't stop him. When there were no witnesses, he'd let himself be the person he'd been before she knew he was king, the person she fell in love with. It was why she avoided being alone with him. "No," she said, not wanting the gentle side of him. Not now. Today she needed him to be the Summer King, to set aside the person he could be without the crown. She needed him to be arrogant and assured, to be able to do what needed doing. Steam rose against her hand as he exhaled, the breath of summer melting her frost. Sometimes, in secret dreams, she'd never tell him. She wondered what would happen if her frost and his sun truly clashed, if they touched as they had in those few weeks before she became Winter Girl, when he was pretending to be mortal for her. Would she melt away? Burn up? She shivered, excited at the thought, and felt the cold well up inside her as her emotions raged like a blizzard. If she didn't keep calm, she'd need to let that awful cold out. "Bria was here last night. You need to know what she's doing." He nodded, weariness on his face, as she told him everything about Bria's initial visit when Aslan was chosen, about the attack on Aslan outside the library, about her brief belief that the attack was Bria's behest, about Agatha's death, about Bria's threats, about her insistence that Aslan not lift the staff. Donya kept quiet about Seth's research, fearing for the moral's safety. But beyond that, she was more honest with Keenan than she'd been in a very long time. When she stopped talking, he stared at her, silent and struggling to contain the temper he rarely freed. She clenched her hands so tightly that the icicles formed on the tips of her fingernails. "Now comes the hard part. Let go. Let's go." He looked over at Sasha, then passed the wolf to the tiny mementos handed down by the other Winter Girls. "The guards will bring you things. We can turn the study into a private chamber and..." "Keenan," she interrupted before she could be tempted. He'd see the logic of what needed to be done if he thought clearly. She needed to assure that he did so. She opened her hand. Icicles fell and shattered at her feet. "I'm not going anywhere." "You can't stay here. If something happened to you..." He bowed his head, letting his forehead rest on her knee. "Please, Don, come with me." "Where is the Summer King?" But it wasn't the king who laid his head in her lap, pleading. She didn't move away. It burned her, froze him, but she stayed still. "I can't come with you. It's not my place. I'm not the one you're looking for." He looked up at her, an ugly frost-bitten bruise forming where his skin had touched her knee. "I'm not strong enough to stop her, but I will be soon. Stay with me until we get this sorted out." "And what would she do to me when I left?" "I'll be strong soon." He was almost frightening in this insistence. His eyes darkened to that unearthly green hue she still dreamed of. If she stared long enough, she'd see flowers blooming there, a promise of what he would become once his queen freed him. She couldn't look away. He whispered, "Stay with me. I'll keep you safe." "You can't." She wished she could, but it was impossible. There was no winning, not for her. I want you to win. I always have. But I still have to try to convince Aslan not to believe in you, that you're not worth the risk. Those are the rules. I gave my word when I lifted the staff. We both did. He put a hand on either side of her, his fingertips burning her skin through her clothes. Even if it means Bria wins, even if she kills you, we can work together, find a way. She shook her head. For all his centuries, far more than she'd ever see, he could still be so reckless. It usually infuriated her. Today she found it saddening. If she wins, she won't kill me. It's only if you win that I'll die. Then why me? Then why tell me? I need to win. He looked awful, pale and sickly, like he'd been skewered by iron spikes. He moved further away from her, crouched on the floor, head bowed where they couldn't touch. He sounded as broken as he looked. If you stop Aslan, I lose everything. If you don't, you die. What am I to do? Hope I lose, she suggested softly. No. She stood up and walked over to him. I'm terrified of Bria, but I truly do hope that Ash is the one, for both of your sakes. You'll still be a shade. That doesn't fix anything. Where's the Summer King? She sighed as she watched him struggle between what he had wanted and the inevitable. Not all dreams come true. If it make things easier, she'd be cruel. It wouldn't help, though. She leaned over him, holding her hair back so it didn't fall against him. It fixes a lot of things. It make me lose Keenan. Convince her you're worth the risk. She kissed his cheek. Because you are. It was easier to say it, knowing Bria would kill her, knowing that she wouldn't spend an eternity with him, knowing she still loved him. Knowing she wouldn't spend eternity with him, knowing she still loved him. I can't. She put her hand over his mouth. Convince her. She pulled her hand away, lips firmly closed to keep the icy air from his mouth, and kissed him. Then kill Bria. We're at chapter 19. Yeah. This is where things get really, the last couple chapters and this chapter, things get really good, and I love it. Needed to wet my whistle a little bit. Alright. Chapter 19. Keenan was shaken when he left Donya. He walked aimlessly through the city, wishing, wanting an answer. There wasn't one, unless Aslan was his missing queen, and he was able to convince her to trust him, to accept him. There was nothing he could do. He simply wasn't strong enough to stand against Bria. If I were, he smiled at the thought, stopping Bria. Maybe in time to save Donya. That was the only recourse they had. But if Aslan's sight was that thing which the Aeolas spoke of, and that would be in their nature, it was all for nothing. Donya would die, and he would still be bound. A small trickle of summer that he could call was nowhere near enough to stand against Bria. He rested his head against an oak tree, eyes closed. Breathe. Just breathe. Aslan was different, perhaps enough. Perhaps she was the one. But she might not be. The Aeola's proclamation, which the Fae had heard as herald of the Summer Queen's discovery, could be nothing more than a revelation that she was sighted. She might not be the one. He just turned toward the greener part of the city when he heard Bria's hags approach. They followed at an almost respectful distance until he reached the river. At the riverside, he sat, feet on the soil, sun in his back, and waited. Better here than at the loft. The last time she visited, Bria had frozen as many of his birds as she could when he left the room. He'd returned to find them dead on the ground, or affixed to branches, hanging like awful ornaments at the tips of icicles. Unless he could stop her, one of these times it could be the summer girls or his guards who felt her temper. Bria stood in the shadow of the garish awning held over her by several of her nearly naked guards, Hawthorne people, and one slick-skinned troll, all sporting fresh bruises and frostbitten skin. What? No hug? No kiss? Bria held out a hand. Come here, dearest. I'll stay out here. Keenan didn't bother getting up. He just glanced at her. I like the warmth on my skin. She wrinkled her nose and made a little mow of distaste. Nasty stuff, sunlight. He shrugged, talking to her now. After seeing Donya, after all the doubts about Aslan, was the last thing he wanted. Do you know that there's a market these days for SPF cloth? She sat back on a blindingly white chair that the hags dragged up for her. Mortals are such strange beasts. Do you have a point, Bria? He never enjoyed her presence, but she threatened Donya. Feigning civility was more of a struggle than usual. Is it so hard to believe I just wanted to visit with you? Chat with you? Without looking behind her, she held out a hand. A collared wood sprite slipped an icy drink into her outstretched fingers. You so rarely visit. Keenan reclined on the grass, relishing the strength of the earth's warmth seeping into his body from the soil. Perhaps because you're vicious and cruel? She waved her hand, as if brushing away his comment. You say potato, I say potato. I say integrity, you say deceit. Well, it's such a subjective idea, integrity. She sipped her drink. Can I offer you refreshment, dear? No. He ran his fingers over the soil, sending his warmth down to the resting bulbs. Small flower sprouts rushed out toward his touch. Delicate shoots poked up between his open fingers. I hear you shared quite a bit of refreshment with the new summer girl. Poor dear was dizzy with it. She tisked at him with a censorious look. Haven't I taught you better, getting the poor lamb intoxicated to convince her? You know. That wasn't what it was, he snapped. Aslan and I danced and celebrated her new life. It wasn't a seduction. She stepped out from under her awning, sending her guards scurrying to keep it up over her head as she moved. If they failed, they'd suffer, regardless of whose fault it was. As the shade blocked his comforting rays, Keenan was torn between waiting and simply setting the awning to flame. He stood to face her. Well, if you want my opinion, a mother's wisdom, I say she's not worth it. She glanced at the flowers. They froze in her sight. She stepped forward and, with a grating noise, ground them under her foot. Poor Deborah shouldn't have any trouble convincing her to stay away from you. You didn't ask her to go easy on the mortal, did you? It's Aslan's choice. She'll either take up the staff or not. He wanted to tell her that threatening Donya wouldn't change anything, but he couldn't. I spoke to Donya, which you so obviously know, about Theola's announcement. Oh? She paused, wide-eyed as if she were surprised. What announcement? That Aslan is special. Of course she is, sweetling. They're all special. At least the first few nights. After that, She looked back at the cowering sprite. Novelty just isn't there, you know? He forced a laugh. Poor Delilah. I imagine she's bitter. It wasn't so long ago that she was the one dancing with you. Bria swayed as if she were dancing with an invisible partner, looking elegant even though she was alone. Mortals are such fragile things, such just tender feelings walking around exposed in their delicate shells, easy to crush. His heart sped. The rules prevented her from contacting the mortal girl, and until now Bria had never broken that rule, to the best of his knowledge, but she was already breaking other rules. What do you mean? Nothing, love. She stopped and curtsied to him, pulled out a fan and fluttered it in front of her face, sending cold air toward him. I'm just wondering if you should pick another girl for the game. Let this one join the rest of the other discarded girls. I'll even go girl watching with you. We could pick up Delia and make a bonding experience of it. He let all the bitterness he felt show in his voice and said, Well, at the rate Donya's going, I may need to. Aside from one drunken dance, I'm getting nowhere. There'll be other girls, darling. Bria sighed, but her eyes glimmered with a sheen of ice, a sure sign that she was pleased. But they aren't the summer queen, are they? Perhaps I need to try harder. he said, as he sent a hot breath toward Bria's awning, catching it on fire, and then he walked away, leaving her there shrieking at the guards to keep the sunlight away from her. Someday I'll truly be able to stand against her. For now, he took pleasure in the moment. Keenan wandered the city, up Fifth Avenue, away from the river until he got to Edge Hill. Following it until he reached the seedier shops, the din of the city was a welcome buzz, reminding him of the mortals who thrived there where his kind could not. That's what it's all about. These mortals and his summer fairy. Keenan? Brienne stepped out of the music store and all but ran to him. She gasped at him. What's up with your hair? In his distraction, he had been walking around plainly visible, his hair its normal shade, reflective copper. Dye. He smiled at her, lightening his hair until the metallic glimmer was gone. She reached out and caught a few strands, holding it up to the sunlight, moving it from side to side. For a minute, it almost looked like strips of metal. He pulled back, freeing his hair from her hand. Have you seen Aslan today? She laughed. Nope, thought maybe she was still with you. No, he looked beyond Rianne, to where several of the summer girls were flirting with an off-duty Rowan man. I escorted her home this morning. Morning, huh? She shook her head, still smiling, for all of her posturing. She smelled like innocence to him, untouched and sweet. Her words were at complete odds with her attitude. I knew you were a good bet. We were just dancing. It's a start, right? She glanced around, looking at the street. Back inside the shop, for a moment her illusory lasciviousness vanished, and her genuine personality slipped through. Between you and me, Ash could use a bit more fun in her life. She's too serious. I think you'll be good for her. Keenan paused. He hadn't thought about that very much. All that mattered was that she was good for him, for the summer fae. Was he good for her? Between the sacrifices she'd need to make and the difficulty of what stood before them, if she were the true queen, he wasn't sure. Probably not. I'll try to be Rianne. You've already got her out till dawn dancing. Sounds like a good start to me. Brienne patted him on the arm, consoling him for something she couldn't begin to grasp. Don't worry so much. Right. After she walked away, Keenan faded back into his normal state, invisible to mortals, and resumed walking to the loft. If there was ever a time when he needed the wisdom of his advisors, this was it. Keenan felt the music before he even walked into the loft. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, a false smile on his face. After a cursory glance at him, Tavish removed Eliza's arms from his neck and went towards the study. Come. At times like these, Keenan felt as if having Tavish's presence was almost like having a father. The older fairy had been the last Summer King's advisor and friend. He'd been there waiting when Keenan had come of age and left Bria's household. While Tavish could never presume to act like a father, he was far more than a servant. Noticing their movement, Niall opened his mouth. With a brief shake of his head, Keenan said, No, stay with the girls. If you need me, I do, always. Keenan squeezed Niall's shoulder. Right now, I need you to keep everyone out of here. This wasn't the place to talk. If word got out that he suspected Bria of trickery and maliciousness, if rumors spread that Aslan had the site, it could go badly for all of them. As he wound his way through the room, embraced the summer girls who were spinning dizzily with off-shift guards, Keenan kept his face clear of any doubt. No hint of problems. Smile. By the time he reached Tavish, he was ready to bar the door for the rest of the day. He believed the girls and his guards were trustworthy, but no one ever knew. Not really. He poured a glass of wine. Tavish poured a glass of wine. Here. Keenan took the glass and sank into one of the heavy leather chairs. After Tavish settled in an opposite chair, he asked, What happened? So Keenan told him about Aslan's sight, about Bria's threats, all of it. Tavish stared into the glass like it was a reflecting mirror. He spun it by the stem. She may not be the queen, but Bria fears her. To me, that is reason enough to keep hope. More reason than we've had ever before. Keenan nodded, but did not speak yet. Tavish was rarely direct in his points. Instead of looking at Keenan, Tavish let his gaze drift around the room, as if he were reading the spines of books that lined every wall of the study. I have waited with you, but I never suggested that one of the girls was her. It's not my place. I value your opinion, Keenan assured him. Tell me what you think. Do not let Aslan refuse the challenge. If she is the one, and she does not, Tavish's gaze stayed on the heavy books behind Keenan. She must accept. The older fairy had been Sommer so long that his vehemence was disquieting. Keenan asked, "And if she refuses?" "She cannot. Make her agree." Tavish's eyes were as black as pools in the shadowed forests, eerily captivating. When he finally held Keenan's gaze, "Do whatever you must, even if it is unpalatable to you or her. If you heed only one word I ever say, my liege, make it this one." Chapter 20. When Aslan woke, the clock's red numbers proclaiming it past 9, the evening's events came crashing down on her. The weird drinks, dancing, telling Keenan she knew what he was as they watched the sunrise, him kissing her. That was the last thing she remembered. What else happened? How did I get home? When? She bolted out of bed, barely making it to the bathroom before she threw up. Oh my god. She sat with her face against the cold porcelain until she was sure she could stand without vomiting again. Her whole body trembled, like she had the flu, but it wasn't the flu making her feel awful, it was terror. He knows I see them. He knows. They'll come for me, and Grams, the thought of her Grams fighting fairies almost made her sick again. I need to get out of here. After brushing her teeth and washing her face, Aslan hurriedly slipped on jeans and a shirt, shoved her feet into boots, and grabbed her bag. Grams was in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot, a bit less observant before her morning jolt. Aslan pointed at her ear. Grams turned on her hearing aid and asked, "Everything okay?" "Just running late, Grams. Overslept." Aslan gave her a quick hug and turned to leave. "But breakfast." "Sorry, I need to, meet Seth. Thought I told you?" "We were to have a huge breakfast thing. Date." She tried to keep her voice steady. "Don't let her see how worried I am." Grams was already too fearful after the talk the other night. Adding to that would be selfish. "You know you aren't fooling me, Aslan. Dodging me so that I can ask about that issue? We're going to talk about it." Grams scowled. "It isn't any better, is it?" Aslan paused. "Just a few more days, Grams, please." For a minute, Grams looked like she was going to balk. She pursed her lips and put her hands on her hips. Then she sighed. "Not a few days. Tomorrow we'll talk. You understand?" "Promise." Aslan kissed her goodbye, grateful to put it off even one day more. She wasn't sure she could handle that conversation. Not now. "I need Seth. I didn't even call him last night." "I can't believe I did that." Aslan put her head between her knees and concentrated on not vomiting on her feet. "I told him I knew they were fairies." Seth sat on the floor beside her feet. He was patting her back, making small, soothing circles. "It's okay. Come on. Breathe. Just breathe." "It's not okay, Seth." Her voice was muffled by her decidedly uncomfortable posture. She lifted her head enough to scowl at him. "They used to kill people. Gouge out their eyes for knowing what they were." The nausea rose again. She closed her eyes. "Shh." He moved closer to her, comforting her the way he'd always done when she fell apart. "Come on. What if they blind me? What if—" "Stop. We'll figure it out." He pulled her into his lap, cradling her like a child. Just like Keenan did last night. She tried to stand up, feeling guilty, like she'd betrayed Seth even though all she did was dance. She hoped. "What if Keenan, she started to sob again. "Shh." Seth rocked her, murmuring reassuring words, and she let him, until she started to think about fairies again, and dancing with Keenan and kissing him and not knowing what else might have happened. She pulled away and stood. Seth stayed on the floor. He propped his head up on one hand, his elbow on the seat of the chair where she'd been sitting. She ducked her head, unable to look at him. "So what do we do about it?" He came to stand beside her. "We improvise. He promised you a favor? If the books are right, vows are like laws." She nodded. He stepped in front of her and leaned forward until the longer strands of his hair fell like a web over her face. "The rest we'll deal with too." Then he kissed her, softly, tenderly, lovingly, and said, "We'll get this figured out. Together. I'm here with you, Ash. Even after you tell me what else happened." "What do you mean?" Aslan felt the world swim again. "You drank something that messed you up and danced until dawn and woke up in your bed sick." He cradled her face in his hands. "What else happened?" "I don't know." She shivered. Okay, how did you get home? I don't know. She remembered the taste of sunshine, the feel of sunbeams falling onto her as she stared up in Keenan's face as he leaned toward her. What happened? Did you go anywhere else? She whispered. I don't know. Sleep with him? He looked straight at her as he asked it, the question she'd been trying and failing to answer. I don't know. She looked away, feeling sicker with the words hanging there like something awful. I'd know, right? That's something I'd remember, right? He'd pull her into his arms, tucking her under his chin, as if he could keep her safe from all the bad things by keeping her close enough. I don't know. Are there any flashes of memories? Anything? I remember dancing, drinking, sitting on some strange chair, and then the carnival was gone. He kissed me. She shivered again. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault. He stroked his hand over her hair. She tried to pull away. He didn't force her to stay, but he kept his hands on her arms. He looked so serious, so admittant. Listen to me. If something happened, it wasn't your fault. He gave you some drugs, some fairy booze. You were drunk, high, whatever. And what happened afterward isn't your fault. I remember laughing, having fun. She looked down at her hands, clenched tightly so they wouldn't shake. I was having fun, Seth. What if I did do something? What if I said yes? Doesn't matter. If you're fucked up, you can't consent. It's that simple. He shouldn't have done anything, Ash. If he did, he's the one who's wrong, not you. He sounded angry, but he didn't tell her that he had been right, that she shouldn't have gone. He didn't say anything awful to her. Instead, he tucked her hair behind her ear and let his hand rest on her face, gently tilting her head so that she looked at him. And we don't know that anything did happen. I just wanted the first time to be with someone special, and if it's just wrong. She felt half foolish for worrying about it, exposed to the wrath of a fairy king, and she worried about her virginity. He could take her life. He could take her eyes. Her virginity shouldn't matter so much, but it does. She walked away, going over to curl up in the comfort of Seth's sofa. I'm sorry. You were right, and he interrupted. There's nothing for you to be sorry for. You're not wrong. I'm not upset with you. It's him. He stopped, didn't move, just stood there in the middle of the room watching her. You're what matters. Hold me, if you still want to, I mean. She looked away. Every day. Then he was there, lifting her into his arms, holding her like she was fragile and precious. I want to hold you every day. Nothing will ever change that. Chapter 21, and I think we're just over an hour here, and we're going to call that for the night. All right. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.